Hey everyone, it's the Diplomat, and we are on part 28 of the Chris Watts Discovery Read-Through, starting here on page 596 at the bottom. We last left off with the pre-test interview, and we will now go into the actual polygraph as well as the post-polygraph interview, including Ronnie and Chris's confession. So I ask, just like last time, that you please take a lot of what you're about to hear with a grain of salt. Obviously, there's a lot of lies in here, so please keep that in mind as you listen. We begin here at the bottom of Discovery, page 596. Next, I asked Chris if he could pass a question on the polygraph related to if he physically caused Shanann's disappearance. Chris replied yes. I asked Chris to tell me what the question meant to him and what he believed I was asking. Chris stated, in quotes, "I feel like you're asking me, did I have anything to do with it myself, or did I help somebody do it? And I had no part in any of that," end quote. I asked Chris to tell me all the ways someone could physically make someone disappear. Chris replied, in quotes, "I mean, like, if you're talking about like what I've seen like on the movies, or like how like people, if you read about other people, I mean, you hire somebody like a hitman. I'm just being honest," end quotes. I asked Chris to think about all the possible scenarios in his head, and he said he could hire someone, or a person would use someone they knew to do it. At that point, Chris giggled and told me it was a hard question to answer because he had nothing to do with the disappearance. Chris said he didn't like to think about it. I explained to Chris that a person could physically cause another person's disappearance by murdering them. Chris agreed with my statement. I asked Chris to list all the physical ways a person could cause someone's disappearance through murder. Chris stated, in quotes, "Stab someone, shoot someone, hit them with a blunt object. What else is there? I mean, use a weapon of like a gun or a knife," end quotes. Chris appeared to be thinking, so I said, "You could smother someone." Chris repeated what I said, and I immediately said, "You could strangle someone." Chris said, in quotes, "You could hang someone. Yeah, you can, all that kind of things. I mean, it's hard to even think about that kind of stuff right now," end quotes. I continued with telling Chris a person could drown, shock, or burn someone to death. I asked Chris if he could think of any other ways to murder someone, and he said, in quotes, "Lure them into a trap, I guess," end quote. I asked Chris to explain, and he said you could have someone waiting around the corner and an accident could happen, such as getting hit by a car. I told Chris that a person could kidnap another person, and he agreed, and said someone could take a person somewhere and torture them and leave them without food or water. Chris then stated that a person could poison another person or beat them to death as a way to make them disappear. I asked Chris if he would have an issue with that question on the test, and he said he could definitely pass that question. I explained to Chris that I wanted him to make sure that I only wanted to know if he physically caused Shanann's disappearance. I told Chris that sometimes people can feel guilty for causing someone to leave, such as telling a spouse you wanted to be separated. Chris said, in quotes, "That's why I feel like a jackass right now," end quote. I reiterated to Chris that the test was only to ask if he physically caused her disappearance by murder, kidnapping, etc., not just caused her to leave because she was upset over their conversation Monday morning in bed. I explained to Chris that I was only going to ask him about Shanann on the test. I told Chris that it wasn't hard to assume that Shanann and the girls were most likely somewhere together. Chris asked, in quotes, "That's going to loop the kids with it though, right?" end quote. I explained to Chris the polygraph test I was going to administer was only going to ask him questions about Shanann. Next, I told Chris I was going to ask him on the polygraph test if he was lying about the last time he saw Shanann. Chris replied no. I asked Chris to describe the last time he saw Shanann, and he said the last time he saw her was in bed after he talked to her. Chris and Shanann were lying in bed and had just told him she was going to take the girls to a friend's house and she would be back later. Chris said Shanann was lying on her right side and she had mascara running down her face. Chris explained Shanann didn't take her makeup off before she went to bed that morning. Chris said the last time he saw his children was on the baby monitor as it was cycling back and forth. I told Chris I had to talk about the worst case scenario and told him if he murdered Shanann, that image he described would not have been the last time he saw her. Chris said, in quotes, "I know, I agree with that," end quote. I told Chris if he murdered Shanann in the house, she was obviously removed at some point, so her lying in the bed would not have been the last time he saw her. Chris said he agreed. Lastly, I told Chris I wanted to ask him on the polygraph if he knows where Shanann is now. Chris replied by saying, in quotes, "I do not," end quote. I told Chris he was cooperating with the missing person investigation and the question centered around him actually knowing the location of Shanann, but not telling the police. I told Chris that Shanann could have called him and told him her whereabouts, or if he actually murdered her, he would know the location where he or someone else dumped Shanann's body. I told Chris that if the last time he saw Shanann was she was in bed crying, he would be able to pass the question because we all knew Shanann was no longer in bed. I asked Chris what his answers would be to all three of the posed questions, and he responded, in quotes, "I had nothing to do with what's going on right now. I did not physically harm her. Last time I saw her was in bed laying on her side with some mascara on her face after we had a conversation, and I do not know where she is right now," end quote. I asked Chris who he believed would have hurt Shanann and the girls, and he said he exhausted every option. Chris said he thought it was possibly a stranger who had Shanann and the kids, in quotes, and they're not safe right now, and that they've been physically hurt, end quote. I asked Chris to tell me what he thought should happen to the person if indeed his wife and children were murdered. Chris said, in quotes, "The worst possible thing," end quote. I asked Chris to explain, and he said, quotes, "It's either going to be like life in prison or the death penalty, isn't it? That's the only two things you can really do," end quote. I asked Chris if he had any more information he hadn't shared with the detectives, and he said no. Chris said he exhausted every option of reaching out to friends and family members who may have seen or heard from Shanann. During the entirety of the pre-test interview, Chris denied any involvement in his wife and daughter's disappearance, as well as any infidelity. Next we go into the actual polygraph questions. A polygraph examination was administered using a recognized directed lie comparison technique, the Utah 3-question test. The examination utilized a Lafayette computerized instrument, model LX5000, which continuously monitors and records respiration, electrodermal activity, and cardiovascular functioning. In addition, a motion sensor pad designed to record peripheral behavior activity and cooperation during the examination was utilized. The instrument passed internal self-calibration prior to the exam. I conducted a known acquaintance test to assess Chris's suitability for testing and to establish baseline physiology. Chris was able to follow instructions and showed suitable responses. The following relevant questions were defined and reviewed in detail and asked of Chris over 3 chart repetitions. 1. Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance? Answer, no. 2. Are you lying about the last time you saw Shanann? Answer, no. 3. Do you know where Shanann is now? Answer, no. I assessed Chris's psychophysiological responses to the above relevant questions. It is my professional opinion Chris was not being truthful during the testing. Global analysis of the physiological data revealed it was of sufficient interpretable quality to complete a standardized numerical analysis of the test results. Analysis of the polygraph tests using the empirical scoring system resulted in statistically significant numerical scores that support a conclusion of deception indicated when Chris was answering the above listed questions. Post-test interview. While I was out of the room scoring the polygraph charts, Chris remained in the interview room and watched videos on his cell phone of his girls giggling and playing. SA Coder and I returned to the room to speak with Chris about his deception. We also had a printed photograph of Bella and Celeste we placed on the table in front of Chris. I informed Chris it was clear he was not honest during the testing, and he did not pass the polygraph test. Chris replied by saying, in quotes, "Okay." I told Chris we now needed to talk about what actually happened. Chris stated, in quotes, I didn't lie to you on that polygraph. I promise," end quotes. S.A. Coder told Chris it was time and asked him to stop and take a deep breath. I told Chris that I appreciated him coming to take the polygraph, even though he knew he wasn't going to pass the test. I told Chris he stayed because he knew he needed to get everything off of his chest. I asked Chris if he could start again and tell us everything that happened. Chris said everything he said was true. I told Chris the most important thing was to find out what happened to Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. Chris said, "Okay." I told Chris that holding the lie inside of him would do nothing for him, and he responded, in quotes, "I know, this, I'm not, trying to, cover things up," end quote. Chris said he wants his wife and children to come back home. I told Chris he knew his wife and children were not coming back home. Chris continued to say he hoped his wife and children would come back home, in quotes, "and I don't know they're not coming back home," end quote. S.A. Coder explained to Chris that we were confused and we had received a lot of leads over the past day. Chris continued to say he didn't know where his wife and children were located. Chris said, in quotes, "If I could have my babies back home right now, I would. I want them back. I want everyone back. That is the God's honest truth," end quote. S.A. Coder told Chris he couldn't understand why there were two Chris's. Chris then said, in quotes, "I cheated on her. I'm not proud of it. She accused me of it. I denied it, and I feel horrible for it. She was pregnant. I didn't hurt her. I cheated on her. I hurt her emotionally," end quote. Chris admitted he also did not attend the Rockies game. Chris said he went to dinner with her the night of the Rockies game. Chris said the 5 weeks he spent alone, he spent it with her. Chris explained he fell out of love with Shanann because he fell in love with her. S.A. Coder asked Chris what her name was, and Chris said he didn't want to get her involved in what was going on and didn't want to ruin her life. Chris said she was a wonderful person who knew he was married and that he was having issues in his marriage. Chris said he told her he was going to get separated from Shanann, but he didn't know what that was going to look like. Chris said she took his breath away, and he never thought in a million years something like that could happen. Chris said he never felt the same way about anyone in his lifetime as he did about her. S.A. Coder told Chris that he didn't think his girlfriend hurt anyone, and asked Chris if they could leave her out of it and get back to talking about his wife and daughters. Chris agreed. S.A. Coder asked Chris where his wife and children were located, and he said he didn't know. Chris said the affair was the only thing he was holding back. S.A. Coder reminded Chris that he was not questioned about infidelity on the polygraph. S.A. Coder then informed Chris we already knew all about his girlfriend. The mistress, later identified as, her name listed, age 30, birthday July 3rd, 1988. S.A. Coder told Chris we were very concerned about his wife and daughters, and Chris said he was also concerned. S.A. Coder told Chris that it should have been the happiest time in their marriage. S.A. Coder said he believed Shanann may have been a controlling person who didn't listen to him and could do whatever she wanted. S.A. Coder said he wanted to give Chris an opportunity to help us find Shanann and the kids. Chris said he would do whatever he could do to help us find his wife and children. Chris said he didn't know where his wife and kids were located. S.A. Coder reminded him that his father flew across the country and was waiting in the lobby. S.A. Coder told Chris he was lying to his father and everyone he talked to. S.A. Coder pleaded with Chris to help us find his babies. Chris said he wanted to find them. S.A. Coder asked Chris if we could go back and talk about that night. Chris agreed, and S.A. Coder told Chris that the police had his Alexa, which he explained was trained to record distress, and the police also had the contents of his mistress's, and Shanann's text messages. S.A. Coder asked Chris to tell us again about that evening. Chris reiterated he woke up at 4 a.m. and woke up Shanann at 4:15 to talk about the house and separation. S.A. Coder asked Chris if they talked about his mistress, and Chris said Shanann accused him of having someone else. Chris said he denied having an affair. Chris said Shanann asked him why he had a $68 at dinner the other night and asked him if there were two of them at dinner. Chris admitted the charge came from his dinner with his mistress. Chris said he couldn't bring himself to admit the affair because he and Shanann were already crying very hard. Chris said he told Shanann he just wanted to separate. S.A. Coder asked Chris about selling the house, and Chris and Shanann initiated the selling of their home the week prior because both of them knew they couldn't afford to live on their own. Chris said Shanann contacted their realtor named Ann, unknown last name. On Monday, August 13th, he, Chris, sent Ann a text message asking what she could do. S.A. Coder then asked Chris to tell him about the pregnancy. Chris said Shanann was about 80-20 when they talked about the pros and cons of having a third child. Chris said after Shanann got pregnant, she told everyone it was his idea. Chris said he wanted to have a son. Chris said Shanann told her friends after she was pregnant she was 70-30 against the pregnancy. Chris said he was confused why Shanann would say such a thing. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he understood that some of what he was saying didn't make sense. Chris said, in quotes, "I know." S.A. Coder said he didn't understand how a woman and two kids could vanish off the face of the earth. Chris said, in quotes, "I promise you, I've nothing on my hands I did nothing to those kids or her to make them vanish," end quote. Chris told us it was on video that he left and was in his truck. Chris said, in quotes, "I didn't, load anything into my truck besides my tools, my container, my book bag, my water jug, my lunchbox," end quote. S.A. Coder asked Chris what happened next, and Chris said he drove out of his driveway. S.A. Coder asked Chris what happened with his wife and kids before he drove out of his driveway. Chris said, in quotes, "I didn't do anything with them. They were still in the house," end quote. S.A. Coder asked Chris where his wife and kids went, and Chris said he didn't know. S.A. Coder told Chris that his wife wasn't the type of person to vanish, and Chris agreed. S.A. Coder told Chris that his wife had plans that day and during the week and did not leave because she wanted to. Chris said, K. Chris said he didn't do anything to Shanann or the girls. I asked Chris if it was an accident, and he replied, "I didn't do anything." I again asked Chris if it was an accident, and he said there was not an accident, and if there was, he wasn't in the house when it occurred. Chris said he did not cause an accident and didn't do anything to his wife and kids. S.A. Coder asked Chris if it was a misunderstanding, and Chris said the only misunderstanding was that he didn't tell Shanann about the affair. Chris said he couldn't bring himself to tell Shanann about the affair. S.A. Coder asked Chris how the separation was going to work, and Chris said he planned on getting his own place. Chris said he anticipated having 50-50 split with the kids. Chris said he planned to take it slow with his mistress to see if anything developed. I told Chris I found it hard to believe he and Shanann had an emotional conversation with Shanann where they were both crying and he had yet to shed one tear in the 2 days we interviewed him. Chris said he loved the girls and it didn't mean anything that he hadn't shed any tears. At that point, Chris appeared to force a sniffle. Chris said him not crying didn't mean he didn't love his kids or his wife. I told Chris it didn't make any sense, and he said in quotes, I'm hoping they're still somewhere, alive," end quote. I told Chris he no longer had his girls to take care of, and the loss of them should cause him pain. Chris said he did feel pain. I told Chris I wanted to see the guy who felt bad about what he did and wanted to get it off his chest so the police could find his little girls, so his girls were not out in the middle of a field somewhere. Chris said in quotes, "I love those girls to death," end quote. Chris said he was showing us the Chris who cared about his girls and wife. Chris said his lack of tears didn't mean he lacked love for them. I told Chris it was weird and didn't make any sense. Chris said he understood and could see my point. I told Chris that I understood how some people could be pushed to do something they regret. Chris said I know. S.A. Coder told Chris that we could keep talking to him once we found his girls. S.A. Coder told Chris we would continue to talk to him no matter what he told us. I asked Chris if Shanann did something to the girls, and he said, in quotes, "No, I don't know. I have no clue," end quote. I asked Chris, did Shanann do something to them, and then did you feel like you had to do something to Shanann? Chris sighed and said, in quotes, No, they were at the house when I left. They were there," end quote. I told Chris the only way Shanann and the girls could have left was in his truck. Chris said, in quotes, there's no way, 'cause, I didn't just throw them in my truck, end quote. I reminded Chris his truck had GPS installed. I asked Chris if he knew the GPS would ping every 10 seconds, and he said yes. I told Chris we were going to find out exactly where he went. Chris said in quotes, I know, end quote. S.A. Coder asked Chris if we weren't asking him the right questions, and Chris said in quotes, you're asking all the questions, end quote. S.A. Coder asked Chris what we were doing wrong, and he said we weren't doing anything wrong. S.A. Coder asked Chris if Shanann did something, and he said in quotes, I don't think she did anything to these kids. We both love them with all of our hearts. There's no way, end quote. I told Chris it could have been an accident because I knew something happened inside his house. I asked Chris if something happened to his baby girls, and then he felt like he needed to take something into his own hands and deal with it. S.A. Coder asked if he had to clean up something for Shanann. I told Chris I knew he loved the girls with all of his heart, but sometimes people make mistakes. S.A. Coder asked Chris what he was thinking about, and he replied, in quotes, she couldn't have, end quote. I asked Chris which one of his girls had breathing problems. Chris explained both of his girls had inhalers, but Cece had the endoscopy and surgeries. I asked Chris if he thought Cece had trouble breathing, and Shanann freaked out and decided she didn't want to live without her baby girl. Chris said he didn't think so. Next, I talked to Chris about a cold case homicide from Aurora, where a male beat a family to death with a ball-peen hammer. I told Chris that the only survivor of the attack was a 3-year-old girl. I told Chris the girl grew up with no family, and she admitted she wished she had died with her family. I told Chris I have seen parents panic and decide their children can't live without each other. I told Chris I have also worked on a case where a mother smothered her 2 children because she didn't want her husband to take her children away from her. I told Chris that the mother felt like she was doing right by her children and was saving them future pain. Chris looked at me and asked, in quotes, why? How's she saving them pain, end quote. I told Chris the mom didn't want them to have to live a life without her. S.A. Coder told Chris it was a weight that was going to be on him forever unless we could resolve it. I told Chris we were giving him a lifeline, and he needed to reach out and take it. S.A. Coder then pointed to the photograph of Bella and Celeste and asked Chris if the girls looked like the photograph. Chris pointed to Celeste and explained she wore the same dress on August 8th or 9th because he recalled having to unbutton 2 buttons on the back of the dress in order to get her pajamas on that evening. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he made sure the girls were warm when they left the house, and Chris seemed confused and said the girls were always warm and their beds were always warm. S.A. Coder asked Chris if they were taking care of the girls at the very end, and he said the girls were always taken care of and never missed a meal. I told Chris he took the girls out of the house with their blankets and animals because he cared. Chris said in quotes, I'm always caring for these kids. There's nothing in this world. They're my life, end quote. I told Chris I believed he or Shanann made a mistake. I told Chris I was getting concerned that maybe he did something to all 3 of them. Chris said in quotes, I did not do anything to these kids, end quote. I asked Chris what Shanann did to the girls, and he immediately asked if he could talk to his dad. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he would please tell his dad what happened. Chris said he had been in there for 5 to 6 hours and asked if he could just talk to his dad. S.A. Coder recommended Chris's dad come into the interview room instead, since there was a lot of activity in the lobby area of the police department. S.A. Coder asked Chris what he would tell his dad, and Chris said he would tell his dad he loved him and wanted him by his side. S.A. Coder told Chris that it seemed he wanted to get everything off his chest and asked him if he could explain further what happened between Shanann and the girls. Chris said he talked to Shanann about the separation, the house, and Shanann asked about the affair. Chris said Shanann had mascara running down her face and it was very emotional. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he promised to talk to his dad and tell him everything, and Chris agreed. S.A. Coder asked Chris if it would be easier for him to tell his dad and his dad could tell us. Chris said, in quotes, I don't know. S.A. Coder said he believed Chris was the type of guy who needed to take responsibility. S.A. Coder said he was worried that his dad would distract him, and Chris asked if S.A. Coder meant it would distract him from talking to us. Chris said he just needed to talk to his dad. At that point, S.A. Coder and I met with Chris's father, Ronnie, in the lobby. Ronnie was wearing a polo shirt that had, in quotes, Papa Ronnie embroidered on the chest. We explained to Ronnie that Chris wanted to talk to him about what happened. We also informed Ronnie that everything that was said in the interview would be audio and video recorded. Ronnie said it was fine and told us he understood. Ronnie was escorted to the interview room, and we told Ronnie and Chris they could have as much time as they needed. Chris pointed to the digital recorder on the table and asked if we were going to leave it in the room, and we said yes. The door was shut for privacy, but still had the key in the lock. Ronnie asked Chris if he was going to tell him what was going on. Chris told Ronnie he failed the polygraph. Chris said, in quotes, "They're not going to let me go," end quote. Ronnie asked if there was a reason why the police wouldn't let him go. Chris said the police knew he had an affair. Ronnie asked Chris if he was going to tell him what happened. Chris said when he and Shanann had a conversation that morning, it was very emotional as they spoke about the separation. Chris said he went downstairs and then told his dad, in quotes, "I don't want to protect her. I don't want to protect her. But I don't know what else to say," end quotes. Ronnie asked what happened, and Chris replied, in quotes, "She hurt them. And then I freaked out and hurt her," end quote. Ronnie asked Chris if Shanann and the girls left after that, and Chris didn't answer. Ronnie asked if Shanann started hurting the kids, and Chris said, in quotes, they were, end quote. Ronnie told him to talk to him and tell him what happened. Chris whispered, in quotes, She smothered them. They were smothered," end quote. Ronnie immediately asked, "They what?" Chris answered, in quotes, "She strangled them." Ronnie asked, "She smothered them or choking them?" Chris replied by saying, in quotes, "Like, I didn't hear anything. When I was downstairs, I came back up and they were gone. I don't know. Like me talking about her and all about that, talking to her about the separation and everything, about, like, I don't know, like, what else to say. Like, 'cause I freaked out and I did the same thing to fucking her. Those were my kids," end quote. Ronnie asked Chris if Shanann freaked out over the separation and he was leaving for work. Chris said Shanann laid back down when he went downstairs, but he heard a little commotion upstairs and didn't think much about it. Chris said he went back upstairs and saw Shanann on top of Cece. Ronnie asked Chris if Shanann was choking Cece and if Shanann killed Cece. Chris said, in quotes, they were blue, end quote. Ronnie asked, both of them? And Chris said, yes. Ronnie asked if Shanann choked both of them to death, and he said, in quotes, I freaked out and did the same thing to fucking her, in quotes. Ronnie said, oh my God. Chris said he didn't call the police about what happened. Ronnie asked, so then what did you do? Haul the bodies off or something? Chris said he didn't know what else to do and freaked out. Ronnie reiterated that Shanann choked both Bella and Cece to death, and Chris, quote-unquote, lost it, and then choked Shanann. Ronnie clarified with Chris if he choked Shanann, and Chris said, it's rage. Chris told his dad he was sorry, and Ronnie told him he knew he was sorry. Chris said he knew Shanann knew in her heart about his affair, but she was waiting for him to admit it. Chris said he believed Shanann just lost it because she knew he was cheating, and he denied it. Ronnie asked Chris if that was the point Shanann went off, and Chris said it was when Shanann started crying. Chris asked his dad what was going to happen. Ronnie asked if Shanann was upset over the separation or the affair. Chris said he believed Shanann thought he was having an affair. Chris said he kept denying the affair to Shanann. Chris said he had talked to Shanann prior about separating, but Shanann hoped they could go to counseling. Chris said he didn't want to go to counseling. Chris told his dad it would be the last time he would see the light of day. Ronnie questioned why Shanann would have to hurt them babies. Ronnie continued to apologize to Chris and told him he would love him no matter what. Ronnie asked Chris if S.A. Coder knew about what happened, and Chris said he wanted to tell him, Ronnie, first. Ronnie said in quotes, well, we need to find a good lawyer and see what the hell they can do, end quote. At that point, S.A. Coder and I re-entered the interview room, and Ronnie said, come on in. I asked Chris if he was doing okay, and Ronnie said, no, he's not. I sat down next to Chris and asked Chris to help us work through everything with him. I asked Chris to tell us what he had told his dad. Chris said after he and Shanann had their conversation on Monday morning, Shanann accused him of the affair and he denied it. Chris said Shanann knew in her heart that he was having an affair. Chris said Shanann also knew about the dinner from Saturday night and that it was too expensive for just him. Chris said he went downstairs, started packing up some things, and heard a couple of things upstairs. Chris said he didn't think about anything about the noise. Chris said he continued packing and went upstairs to talk to Shanann before he left for work. Chris said he saw in the baby monitor that Bella's covers were pulled off and she was just lying in bed. Chris said he figured Bella was just hot. Chris said the baby monitor cycled over to Cece's bedroom, in quotes, and she, Shanann, was in there with her on top of her, end quote. Chris said he freaked out and ran into Cece's bedroom and got on top of Shanann. Chris said Cece was blue, and in quotes, "Those were my babies. Those were my kids," end quote. I asked Chris what happened, and he said, in quotes, "I did the same thing to her, Shanann," end quote. Chris said he was in Cece's room when he did the same thing to Shanann. Chris then described that he put Shanann back in their bed. Chris said he didn't know what to do and was shaking. Chris said, in quotes, "Both my kids were blue, and they were gone. And then, in just like blind, I'm not that person. Like, she hurt my kids. Fuck. I had to do the same thing to her," end quote. I asked Chris what happened after Shanann was in her bed, and he said he pulled the sheets back over Shanann and covered her up, in quotes, "'cause I couldn't see. I couldn't look at her. I felt horrible for what I did. Then I look at my kids and see what she did," end quotes. I asked Chris where Shanann and the girls were located now and told him we needed to find his babies. S.A. Coder told Chris we could help him get his girls out of the cold. Chris said, in quotes, They're gone. There's no bringing them back," end quote. I asked Chris where they were, and they were located at the first location he went to at work that day, which was Survey 319. I asked Chris where they were located at Survey 319, and he said, in quotes, "Right there, off the site," end quote. I asked Chris how he picked the location, and he said it was the first site he was supposed to go to that morning. I asked Chris where we would find his girls at that site, and he said, in quotes, "I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to fucking do. Like, none of this made sense. Why would she hurt my fucking girls?" End quote. I asked Chris if his girls were in something or under the ground. Chris didn't answer, so I asked him if he would take us out there. Chris said there was no way he wanted to go out there. Chris said he would go if we wanted him to, but he didn't want to go. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he could point to where the girls were located, and then we could get them out of the cold. Chris said he was sorry and started to cry. Chris asked us not to think anything less of him. S.A. Coder asked Chris if all three girls were out at Survey 319, and he said yes. I asked Chris what Shanann was doing to Cece, and he said she was on top of her with her hands around Cece's neck. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he actually saw it, and Chris confirmed he saw it on the baby monitor. Chris said that is when he ran into Cece's bedroom and threw Shanann off of Cece. Chris said he saw that Cece was already blue and not moving. Chris said he went into a blind rage and did the same thing to Shanann. I asked Chris if he ever went into Bella's room, and he said after he put Shanann back into their bed, he saw Bella on the baby monitor and just knew by the way she was sprawled out. I asked Chris if that was when he packed up the girls' special stuff, blankets and stuffed animals, and Chris nodded yes. I asked Chris how he got the girls out to Survey 319, and he explained he took them in his work truck. Chris said he put Shanann and the girls right behind his driver's seat. I asked Chris what he was thinking, and he said he was thinking that his babies were gone, and that he put his hands around his wife's neck and, in quotes, did the same thing. I asked Chris if Shanann fought back, and he said, in quotes, not much, because he had a lot of rage. I asked him how he knew Shanann was dead, and he said he knew because she wasn't moving. At that point, Ronnie asked us to look at Shanann's Facebook page. Ronnie explained 2 days ago Shanann posted a photograph of a 5-foot-tall baby doll that was lying on the couch. Ronnie said the doll was completely covered with a sheet. Ronnie said, "I'm thinking this might have been planned. I don't know." Ronnie said the caption read, "What do you say to this?" Ronnie said the sheet covered the doll's head, and the only thing sticking out was the doll's feet. Ronnie said Shanann commented that Bella had put the sheet on the doll. Ronnie said a kid wouldn't do such a thing. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he recalled the incident, and Chris said Shanann made fun of it and thought it was funny. I asked Chris if Bella did it, and he said he didn't know because he couldn't recall. Ronnie said he was around Bella, and Bella would only cover her baby dolls up to their stomach. Ronnie said he never saw Bella cover a doll's head like it was a body. Chris then looked at S.A. Coder and I and said he was sorry for lying to us. S.A. Coder told Chris he was a good man, and Chris immediately responded in quotes, "I'm not a good man," end quote. S.A. Coder told Chris he stayed to talk even though he knew it was going to be difficult. Chris said in quotes, "I stayed here for 6 hours and 11 minutes so far," end quote. Chris was reading the counter on the digital audio recorder. Ronnie said he could understand how rage could come out by seeing your kids dead. Chris told his dad he didn't understand what it felt like to see his daughters blue in the face. I told Chris his dad was going to love him no matter what. Chris looked at his dad and asked how he could still love someone who killed their wife. Chris said in quotes, "Nothing will ever be the same again," end quote. S.A. Coder asked Chris if Shanann was on top of Cece when he got into the room. Chris said yes. Ronnie asked Chris if Shanann's hands were around Cece's throat, and Chris said he didn't know what to do. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he was trying to save Cece, and he said, in quotes, "She was already blue in the face. She wasn't moving. Her head just laying over limp like that," end quote. I told Chris it was very important to know where he put the girls at the oil well site, and he said, in quotes, I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know what else to do. I was so scared. It's like, my wife just did this, and I just did that. What do I do? Anything that I would do from there was just going to be just insensitive and just a horrible thing," end quotes. S.A. Coder told Chris he was in a tough spot. I asked Chris if he would show us where they were located, and he asked, in quotes, "What's going to happen?" S.A. Coder told Chris we were going to help his girls get out of there. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he preferred one of his co-workers go out there, and he said in quotes, "Oh my God, no, end quote. Chris said S.A. Coder told him everyone thinks of him as a good man, but they will say, in quotes, "What the fuck did you do, Chris? Why didn't you just tell the cops to begin with?" end quote. Chris said he could not have his co-workers show us out to the oil well site because they were just going to form their own opinions about him once they figure everything out. S.A. Coder told Chris the girls were still his babies, and I told him he didn't want someone else to find them out there. Chris agreed to show us where they were located at the site. I told Chris that S.A. Coder and I needed to step out of the room to get some things arranged. Ronnie agreed to stay in the room with Chris. While S.A. Coder and I were out of the room, Ronnie told Chris he was sorry. Chris said, in quotes, "I didn't know what the fuck to do. This is just fucking horrible. The problem is, I don't even know if they, the police, believe me or not," end quote. Ronnie said, in quotes, "I know you'd never do nothing to hurt no children. Never. That was your life right there, those little girls," end quote. Chris told Ronnie that his mother always said Shanann was an unstable person, but he never believed in a million years that could happen. Ronnie said he was asked if he thought Shanann could do anything to hurt Bella and Cece, and he told them, in quotes, "No. Herself? Maybe," end quote. Ronnie said he didn't have a clue Shanann could do such a thing. Chris asked his dad, in quotes, "Why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to those 2 little girls?" end quote. Ronnie told Chris he was sorry. Ronnie told Chris he would get him a lawyer and would see what they could do. Ronnie asked Chris if Shanann killed both of their girls while they were sleeping, and Chris said, "Yep." Chris said, in quotes, "I emotionally drove her to do something stupid," end quote. Ronnie told Chris it was not his fault and not to blame himself for it. Chris said, in quotes, "It's all I can do right now," end quote. Ronnie said they would probably call it a crime of passion, and Chris replied, in quotes, "I don't know, just because I hit it. That's the thing. That's the thing that's going to break the camel's back right there. I didn't just call the police right after it happened," end quote. Chris asked Ronnie if he told his mom yet, and Ronnie said no. Chris told Ronnie that Shanann had a temper, and one minute she would be okay, and the next minute she would not be okay. Ronnie asked Chris what Shanann said that morning when he told her everything. Chris said Shanann asked him why, and asked him why he wanted to give up. Chris said Shanann told him, in quotes, "Fuck you, and fuck you, and fuck you," end quote.
Ronnie continued to question Chris about why Shanann would take any of it out on the girls. Chris said he ruined everyone's life, which included his family and friends. Chris then asked his dad if he, Chris, should call his foreman and tell him he was going to go out to the oil well site. Ronnie asked if he could just describe where Shanann and the girls were, and Chris said no. Ronnie asked Chris if they were buried in something, and Chris said, Shanann is. Ronnie asked about the babies, and Chris said, in quotes, That's what I feel horrible about. They're in a freaking oil tank. I didn't know what else to do. Please, God, forgive me for everything. End quote. Ronnie said, babies, babies, babies. Chris replied by saying, they're gone. Chris said Shanann took it out on the girls because of him. Chris told his dad that he, Ronnie, didn't know how unstable Shanann was. Ronnie said Chris's mother also believed Shanann was, in quotes, unstable, a narcissist, and bipolar, end quote. S.A. Coder and I returned to the room a short time later, and Ronnie advised he needed to step out to use the bathroom and to text his daughter. Ronnie asked S.A. Coder about finding a lawyer who wasn't a public defender, and S.A. Coder and Ronnie agreed they would discuss it later. I walked Ronnie to the lobby and returned to the room. We returned with a colored photograph, approximately 8.5 by 11 inches, which was taken from a drone earlier the same day. The drone had flown over Survey 319, and the image showed a tank battery and a field surrounding the site, which included the image of what I was informed was a sheet near the bottom of the photograph. I asked Chris what the photograph was, and he confirmed it was of Survey 319. I asked him to tell me the location of Shanann and the girls. Chris asked how old the image was, and I told him it was taken today. Chris looked at the photograph and pointed to the patch of dirt in the field below where the tank batteries were located. Chris advised Shanann was buried at that location. Chris then pointed to both oil tanks and advised Bella and Celeste were in the tanks. I gave Chris a pen and asked him to mark where everyone was located. Chris put an S where Shanann was located and a B and C on each oil tank to indicate where Bella and Celeste were located in separate tanks. I had Chris sign the bottom of the photograph, and I labeled it with the date and time. S.A. Coder asked Chris if the girls were inside the tanks, and he said yes. S.A. Coder asked Chris if someone who didn't know what they were doing could open the tanks. Chris nodded yes. I asked Chris what was in the tanks, and he said it was a mixture of oil and water. I asked Chris about the sheet located in the field, and he said the sheet was what Shanann had been wrapped in. I asked Chris what the girls were wrapped in, and he said they were just in their pajamas. I asked Chris if they were wrapped in their blankets, and he shook his head no. I asked where the girls' blankets and stuffed animals went, and he advised they probably blew away in the wind. Chris said the blankets and stuffed animals were left by the sheet, which was near Shanann's grave. Chris explained he dug Shanann's grave using a shovel from the back of his work truck. Chris said he always had a shovel with him at work. I asked Chris how Shanann was dressed, and he said she was wearing a black or gray t-shirt and blue underwear. I asked Chris how much time passed from the time he put her back in bed after she was deceased until he put her in her truck. Chris said it only took minutes. I asked Chris if he was sure the girls' blankets and animals weren't going to be in the tanks, and he said no. Chris said the blankets and animals were left near the sheet, by the grave. S.A. Coder asked Chris what the girls were wearing, and he said they were wearing nightgowns. Chris said Cece was wearing a pink nightgown with birds on it, and Bella's nightgown had a unicorn, or believe, on it. S.A. Coder asked Chris how someone could get the girls out of the tank, and he said the girls were inside 20-foot tanks, which had latches on top. S.A. Coder asked Chris how far down the girls were in the tanks, and Chris said it depended on the fluid level in the tank. S.A. Coder asked Chris if there was any chance his baby monitor recorded anything, and Chris said no. S.A. Coder asked Chris what he believed made Shanann snap. Chris said it was Shanann knowing he had an affair, even though he didn't admit anything. Chris said Shanann needed him to admit it, and he refused. S.A. Coder reiterated some of the events Chris had told us and asked him again what he saw when he went downstairs on Monday. Chris said he heard commotion upstairs, but didn't think anything of it. Chris said he'd figured one of the kids got up. Chris said he decided to go back upstairs to talk to Shanann, and in quotes, and go to their room or master bedroom. She wasn't in there, end quote. Chris said he looked in the baby monitor, which was beside the master bed. Chris said he saw Bella and observed Bella's covers pulled back, and she was sprawled out on her bed. Chris said after 3 to 5 seconds the baby monitor cycled over to Cece and he observed Shanann on top of Cece and ran into Cece's bedroom. Chris said Shanann was straddling Cece on the bed. Chris said he walked up from behind when Shanann was on the bed. Chris demonstrated that it looked like Shanann's hand was on Cece's neck. Chris said Cece was lying on her side, so he pulled Shanann off. Chris said Cece was limp and blue. In quotes, there's no movement at all. Chris said, in quotes, you pick an arm up and it just falls, end quote. Chris said he looked at Shanann, got on top of her, and, in quotes, did the same thing. Chris denied having to knock Shanann down and said he pulled her off and onto the bed. Chris said he lost it. Chris said Shanann ended up lying down on the bed when he pulled her off. Chris believed Cece had a queen-sized bed. Chris said Cece was in the middle of the bed with her head near the headboard when he ran into the room. Chris then showed us an image on his cell phone of Cece's bedroom. Chris said he didn't believe Shanann put up a fight because he lost it so much. Chris said he felt so much anger that he didn't feel anything else when he strangled Shanann, and he has no marks on his body. Chris said he was numb, but he felt strangling Shanann was over fast. S.A. Coder asked Chris if it was possible Shanann's neck was broken, and he said he didn't think so. Chris described strangling Shanann with both of his hands, demonstrated on video. I asked Chris if Shanann was strangling Cece with one hand or two, and he said he came from the back and wasn't sure. Chris then explained he knew Shanann was on top of Cece, but the monitor was black and white because it was dark. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he had any idea why Shanann would have hurt the girls, and he said, in quotes, we both loved those kids more than you know, end quote. Chris said people in his family have always told him they believed Shanann was unstable. Chris said his friends, later identified as his friend Mark, also told him they thought Shanann was unstable. Chris then said, in quotes, I don't want to paint a bad picture of her, end quote. I told Chris it didn't look good. S.A. Coder asked Chris if it was possible we would see something on the girls other than the cause of death being Shanann's hands. Chris said no. S.A. Coder told Chris it was hard to believe his wife did it, and Chris said, in quotes, I know. S.A. Coder asked Chris if it was possible Shanann did one daughter and he, Chris, did Shanann and the other daughter. Chris said no. S.A. Coder asked if it was possible we may find his handprints on the girls' necks, and he said, in quotes, no, Lord, no, end quote. S.A. Coder told Chris we would be able to compare the diameter of the finger marks on the girls' necks, and Chris said he understood. I asked Chris what he was thinking about when he said he let his family down. Chris said he let down his dad, his mom, his sister, nephew, nieces, friends, co-workers, everybody. I asked Chris about the point when he witnessed Shanann strangling Cece and pulled Shanann off. I asked Chris if he thought about calling an ambulance, and he said Cece was blue and limp. Chris said he had never seen anything like it in his life. Chris said Cece was laid over, wasn't moving at all, and no gasp of breath. Chris said Cece was totally just blue. I told Chris I had been doing my job for a long time, and I told him most parents will never be able to fathom their child is dead, even if their kid is stiff or blue. Chris said parents always want to call to see if someone can revive their child. I asked Chris to explain what was going on in his head, and he said, in quotes, the rage that I felt for what she was, what she did, it just took over, end quote. I asked Chris if he agreed it sounded weird, and he said, in quotes, I understand. I see where you're coming from, end quote. I told Chris that I would hate for Shanann to get a bad rap if she didn't have anything to do with it. Chris said, I know. I told Chris it wouldn't be fair, and he said, I know. I asked Chris if he wanted to tell us the truth about what happened, and he said it was the truth. Chris said, in quotes, I did not hurt these girls, end quote. I asked Chris if he was good with the public knowing Shanann killed her daughters. Chris immediately responded by saying, in quotes, I did not hurt these girls, end quote. I asked Chris the question again, and he said, in quotes, yes, because I did not hurt these girls, end quote. I told Chris I didn't think he meant to hurt his girls, and he said he didn't hurt them. I told Chris he didn't save them either, and he said, in quotes, I know that. Chris said none of it made sense. I asked Chris if he was sure Shanann didn't catch him in Cece's room, and he said, in quotes, no, my God, no.
S.A. Coder told Chris that it looked like Chris found a new life, and the only way to get the new life was to get rid of his old life. Essay Coder told Chris he believed Chris killed the girls before Shanann came home. Chris said no. Chris's voice started trailing off as he said, in quotes, "This is the truth." Chris said he was not a monster and didn't kill his babies. Essay Coder asked what was going to happen when the girl's cause of death comes back to him. Chris said it wouldn't come back to him because he was 100% positive the girl's death wouldn't come back to him. Essay Coder asked who it would come back to, and he said, in quotes, "Shanann was on top of Cece," end quote. Chris said Bella was laid out, sprawled on her bed. Chris said his fingerprints were not going to be on Cece's neck, and the fingerprints would belong to Shanann. Chris said he did not witness what Shanann did to Bella. Essay Coder asked Chris why he took the bodies out of the house and buried them. Chris said he was scared and didn't know what to do. Chris said he was scared of what everything was going to look like. Chris said, in quotes, "My 2 babies were gone, and I just did that to my wife," end quotes. Chris said it was a nightmare. I told Chris that it seemed like Shanann was a pretty good mom, and he said, in quotes, "I was a pretty good dad as well. You don't really know a person until you don't know a person," end quote. I told Chris I would hate for people like Shanann, Bella, and Celeste who couldn't defend themselves to have someone lie about them. Essay Coder asked Chris why he didn't put Shanann in the tanks, and he said he didn't know what to do. Chris estimated Shanann was buried approximately 2 feet down in the ground. Chris estimated it took him 20 to 30 minutes to dig Shanann's grave. I asked Chris how often the tanks were checked, and he estimated once a week. I asked Chris if he wanted someone else to find his girls, and he said he didn't know what else to do. Chris said he was going to Survey 319 anyway that morning and didn't know what else to do. Essay Coder asked Chris what he meant from his prior interview when he, Chris, talked about something happening to his wife and daughters, which was an act of pure evil. Chris said he was referring to the evil that he witnessed when Shanann was on top of Cece. Chris said he also felt evil for what he did to Shanann. Essay Coder asked Chris again about what he witnessed in Cece's room. Chris said Shanann was wearing the same clothes he buried her in. I asked Chris if Shanann ever went to bed when she got home, and he said all of that was true. I told Chris it appeared Shanann may have been up purchasing hair care products at 2:30 a.m. on her cell phone, and her credit card was denied. Chris said he wasn't aware of the purchase if it occurred. I asked Chris if Shanann got upset with him because they didn't have any money, and he said he wasn't aware of the attempted purchase. Essay Coder asked Chris if it was possible Shanann would have a black eye, and he said no. Chris said he did not punch or slap Shanann. Essay Coder asked Chris if Shanann would have a stab mark on her body, and he said no. Essay Coder asked Chris if the coroner was going to find out they were poisoned, and he said no. I asked Chris about what he talked to his mistress about before his wife got home, and he said they always talk, and it was about their day. Chris said the mistress only knew about the disappearance by what she saw in the news. Chris said she didn't know his wife was pregnant, but she does now. Chris said he was scared to tell his mistress about the pregnancy because he felt like she wouldn't have gone on a date with him if she knew. Chris said his mistress knew he was married with kids. Chris asked if we were going to talk to her, and we said yes. Essay Coder asked Chris if she was going to tell us she knew he was going to kill his family, and he said no. Chris said she just knew they were going to hang out more after he got his own place. Chris said in quotes, "She genuinely liked me," end quote. Chris begged us not to put her name in the news because she had been through enough in her life. I asked Chris if he felt sorry for what he did, and he said, in quotes, "I wish I wouldn't have lost control and got on top of Shanann and did that. And then I did that," referring to dumping them at the oil well site, end quote. Chris apologized to myself and Essay Coder for lying. I told Chris I believed he was there for a reason. Chris said, in quotes, "There's a reason why I came in because, there's a reason why I didn't come in with a lawyer either. So I just, and this is going to happen, so," end quote. I told Chris I was struggling with the fact that as many people who would say he was a good person and would never do such a thing, there were an equal amount of people who would say the same thing about Shanann. Chris said, "I know." I told Chris I was struggling with it, and he said, "I know." Essay Coder then asked Chris how we could prove Shanann murdered the girls. Chris said we could examine the bodies and compare the hand marks on their necks. I asked Chris if he was sure they would have hand marks and that they weren't smothered, and he said, in quotes, "They shouldn't have been smothered. No. And Bella, I don't know, but Cece, Shanann was on top of her, Cece, and her head was to the side." End quote. I asked Chris if he saw Shanann using a pillow on top of Cece, and he said no. I asked Chris why there were sheets inside the kitchen trash. Chris said he used the fitted sheet to wrap up Shanann, found at the oil well site, so he didn't know what to do with the flat sheet and pillowcases that were left over. I asked Chris why he didn't try to hide the sheet out at the oil well site, and he said he was so scared and didn't know what to do. S.A. Coder asked Chris if someone came up on him, and he said no. Chris said he knew his coworkers were on their way out to the oil well site. I asked Chris about the electronics taken from his residence and asked him if he could provide me with their passwords. I wrote down the passwords which are attached to this report. S.A. Coder then asked Chris if he had any questions for us. Chris asked to use the restroom. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he had any weapons on his person, and Chris said no. S.A. Coder conducted a pat-down search of Chris and then escorted him to the restroom. S.A. Coder returned Chris to the room. S.A. Coder and I returned to the room with Chris a short time later and asked him if he was positive Bella and Celeste were inside the tanks. Chris said yes. Chris said he put the girls into the tanks by the hatch on the top. Chris said he had to walk up the stairs and then open the latch. I told Chris the detectives on scene said they could barely fit their arms through the latch. Chris drew an imaginary shape on the table with his hand to show us the approximate diameter of the hatch. I asked Chris if it was hard to get the girls into the tanks, and he said no. I asked Chris if he had to push the girls into the tanks, and he said not really. I asked Chris if Shanann was buried because he knew she was too big to fit in the tank, and he said yes. I asked Chris if each girl was going to be in separate tank, and he said yes. Chris then advised he didn't know how much fluid was in the tanks. I asked Chris if he could hear them drop, and he said Bella's tank seemed emptier than Cece's. I asked Chris if it sounded like Bella would have hit the bottom, and he said he heard a splash. I asked Chris if it was possible he put the girls in the tanks when they were alive, and he said in quotes, "No, God, no, 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 God, no, God, no," end quote. Chris said there was no chance the girls were alive when they were dropped into the tanks. I asked Chris if the coroner was going to find any resuscitation marks on the girls. Chris asked, in quotes, like from CPR or something, end quote. Chris said no. I asked Chris if he knew CPR, and he said he took a class one time at work, which was 2 years ago. Chris said the class used adult dummies, and he wouldn't even know how much pressure to apply to a child. Chris confirmed the girls were gone, so he didn't attempt any sort of resuscitation. I asked Chris if he ended up checking on Bella, and he said yes. Chris said Bella was, in quotes, blue in the face, not moving. I didn't hear anything as far as a pulse or a beat of any kind, end quote. S.A. Coder and I thanked Chris for speaking with us, and S.A. Coder asked Chris if he was hungry. Chris said he felt bad eating our food. S.A. Coder brought Chris 2 pieces of pizza and a bottle of water. Note, I gave Chris an additional 2 slices of pizza a short time later, which he also consumed. We then allowed Ronnie to return to the room to tell Chris goodbye, as a police officer was going to drive Ronnie to a hotel for the night. Ronnie told Chris the police took his Lexus. Ronnie said the other detectives he talked to said Chris's story changed a few times. Ronnie asked Chris if the baby monitor was upstairs or in the kitchen. Chris said it was upstairs, and Ronnie said he thought Chris said it was in the kitchen. Ronnie told Chris he loved him no matter what. Ronnie said he was interviewed, and he told the detectives there was no way Chris would ever hurt his children. Ronnie said it was a problem he didn't call the police, and Chris agreed. Ronnie said they would just have to prove it some other way. Ronnie said it was unfortunate his baby monitor didn't record. Ronnie hugged Chris and left the police department. S.A. Coder returned to the room and asked Chris to clarify the size of the hatch. S.A. Coder asked Chris to compare it to his paper plate. Chris estimated the hatch was twice the size of his paper plate. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he had to squeeze the girls in to get them into the hatch. Chris said it wasn't right. Chris said he put the girls into the hatch feet first. Chris described the girls with their arms stretched above their head. S.A. Coder asked Chris why he put them in separate tanks, and Chris said he wasn't thinking at that point in time and was scared out of his mind and didn't know what to do.
Chris said he walked up the staircase and put one daughter in the tank and then returned with the second daughter and put her in the second tank. S.A. Coder asked Chris if he had to cut the girls up or anything, and Chris said no. Chris assured S.A. Coder the girls were in the tank batteries. Lastly, I returned to the interview room and asked Chris if an FPD officer could photograph him without a shirt on to make sure he didn't have any marks or injuries on him. Chris agreed, and Officer Matt James photographed Chris's face, head, arms, chest, back, hands, and legs. Officer James advised me the photographs would be turned into their digital evidence storage system. Results 2. Results of the polygraph examination were released to Chris Watts, Detective Baumhover, and the 19th Judicial District Attorney's Office. The report package will be mailed to Detective Baumhover, which will include the original advisement of rights form, consent form, and biographical form. The audio recording and videos from the polygraph and interviews are attached to this report. Attachments: Watts Miranda advisement, Watts Poly Bio form, Watts Poly consent, iNet Now app issues, emails between Watts and his mistress, polygraphs 1 through 6, disclosure and disclosure part 2, audio poly and interviews with Chris on August 15th, follow-up interview with Chris on August 15th, Chris signed drone photo of tank site, Chris Watts disclosure part 3, transcript and passwords for Watts' device. So that's where we're going to end part 28, finishing page 611. I know that was a lot that we just heard between Tammy, S.A. Coder, Chris, and even Chris's dad, Ronnie. Obviously, they're starting to work on building a defense and talked much about getting lawyers. We know how that all turned out in the end. And I think that's largely due to an extraordinary job done by the agents here, Tammy and S.A. Coder, as well as the support I'm sure they were getting in the background. And this was really a work of art. They played right to Chris's narcissism. They played right to Chris's belief that he, if he just kept going with this story, he may get out of it. And it's really impressive how they can go through such information. They know they had to balance not scaring Chris off with trying to find his wife and children. So they did an amazing job here. And also a great learning here was with the polygraphs. I never knew that polygraphs were done this way. Very, very regimented. Very specific here in this 3-question test. I never knew that they give everything up front to the person they're performing the polygraph on, and they really made it in such a way that it wasn't going to include a whole bunch of information. They wanted very good information as to whether Chris was lying on just a few things, all related to Shanann, her whereabouts. So if they found deception there, that certainly proved that he did know where she was. And so that's what they were going after. Just a masterful job here, and really hats off to them and what they did for the family, for the state of Colorado, and the local township in getting Chris's cooperation and ultimate confession. In loving memory of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, you're all missed very much. God, please bless the Rusek family and all that have been involved in this. This is The Diplomat. Have a great day.